On Friday, we got the worst kind of news that you could get in the form of a tweet from former WCW and TNA announcer Mike Tenay that Don West passed away at the age of 59. He said, just heard from his wife Terry that our brother Don West will be spending New Year's in heaven. Terry said that D-Dub finally had to tap out from his match with lymphoma. We bonded as soon as we met, both as broadcast partners and friends. Years of great moments, both on and off camera. And that broke my heart when I read that. This was only a little more than a week after Tenay had posted a photo of Don from their FaceTime call. He got to FaceTime with him thanks to Don's wife, and he called it the best Christmas gift that he could ask for. Jeff Jarrett, who hired West when he came to TNA, tweeted, "Rest in peace and power, Don West. When I received the text from Don's wife, Terry, earlier today on his passing, I had an overwhelming feeling of mixed emotions. So happy and relief for him that he was out of pain and his cancer was gone. But the finality of his death was so dark and it hurt. We FaceTimed just a few days ago, and because of the situation, it's the only conversation I've ever had with him that I got to do all the talking, and I'm sure he hated that. We reminisced, laughed, and I got the final opportunity to tell him that I loved him and that I will see him again one day." It was June of last year when Don was diagnosed with brain lymphoma, and I covered this at the time. 3 months after that, he announced that he was in remission. But then a year ago, he announced that the cancer had returned and the tumor had grown to twice the size that it was previously. And there weren't very many updates from Don anymore after that, which is never a good sign. It's a funny thing how things evolve. You know, when I first heard Don West in TNA, this was back in the early days, right? So we're talking the beginning. We're talking the NWA, TNA days. I knew him as the baseball card guy from the Shop at Home network. You know, the guy who would be on there late at night hawking sports memorabilia and talking about Michael Jordan's Gem Mint rookie card. Like, that was the guy that I pictured in my head. I still remember the time he knocked over all the cards on live TV. Never missed a beat. He just got down on the ground. He started swimming in cards. He was still trying to sell them. Because that's what Don was. He was a salesman. He was a pitchman. And a damn good one. The guy could sell ice to an Eskimo. You know, a little fun fact about him. His brother Dale worked for the Shop at Home network. I don't think he owned it or ran it, but he had a pretty high up executive position at the network. And when Don applied for a job there to host his own show, his brother didn't think it was a good idea because of his voice. He said basically his voice was like nails on a chalkboard. He didn't think anybody would want to listen to him for hours on end. And eventually he got the job. And in the time that Don worked there, almost a decade, I think it was about 8 or 9 years that he spent at the network, sales rose from $3 million to $150 million in that 8 or 9 year span. And Don had a lot to do with that. You know, I would not have called him a great wrestling announcer when he first started. I can see what his brother was talking about with that voice and all the over-the-top screaming. But over time, you know, a funny thing happened. He got better. He improved. And he's one of those people I gained an appreciation for that I did not have early on. You know, now I go back and I watch some of those old TNA clips when they pop up on my timeline. The Elix Skipper clip, you know, from the top of the cage. Or Kurt Angle somersaulting off the stage onto Abyss at one of their pay-per-views. Might have been Turning Point. Turning Point or Bound for Glory. I forgot which one. But, you know, I watch those clips and I love and I miss that level of enthusiasm. You know, Jim Ross always had this over-the-top enthusiasm. Mauro Ranallo in NXT had that over-the-top enthusiasm. And Don West, he wasn't a play-by-play guy like those two were, but he had that same level of energy. And that's just something we don't get enough of anymore on commentary. We kind of get it with Pat McAfee. You know, Pat's kind of a throwback, I guess, in that way. But we just don't get enough of that. So it's funny to look back on how I felt then and now. You know, now I would say that if anything, Don is underrated as a color commentator and doesn't get enough love. To the people who grew up being big fans of TNA, Mike Tenay and Don West were to them what Jim Ross and Jerry Lawler were for people who watched, you know, WWE during the Attitude Era. You know, Mike and Don, they made a great combo. And again, I don't think I appreciated them at the time the way that I do now. But his passion was just, it was infectious. I mean, look, I got to meet him in 2011 when TNA held their first Base Brawl show at MCU Park in Coney Island. And back then, I think it was Keyspan Park. In Coney Island, where the Brooklyn Cyclones play. I talked about the whole thing on the Sound Off at the time, episode 166. And I got to see Don in action up close for the first time. You know, waiting in line outside the stadium. He was pitching his brown bag special that had a bunch of random items in it. And I was worried for him. I was worried that this guy was going to drop dead of a heart attack. His face was just turning beet red as he was making the sales pitch. It was exhausting to listen to. You know, he would wear you out, but it worked. He sold every one of those brown bags. He had a crowd around him. And you want to know how much of an asset that Don West was to TNA when it came to their merch. Bruce Pritchard, on his podcast once, said that Don West may have single-handedly been responsible for TNA house shows turning a profit because of their merchandise sales. He claims they would make more from their merch than they would at the gate. Think about that. They made more money off all the shit that they would sell once you got into the building than they did on the tickets to the actual shows themselves. And he said the WWE would draw about $15 per head at the time in merch. TNA was drawing $24 or more at a lot of their events. That is nuts. The first TNA show I ever went to was their first New York City shows at Webster Hall. When the show was over, they did a gimmick where for $20 you could get in the ring and take your picture with Kurt Angle. He was the world champion at the time. He had just finished wrestling Christian Cage in the main event. So I said, you know, I was with my brother at the show that night. A friend of mine, I think, was going to come and couldn't make it. I was like, as we're leaving, I'm looking, because there was kind of a log jam, and we had tickets in the first few rows. So I'm already at ringside. I'm up against the ring. I'm leaning on the apron. Kurt's in the ring. People are coming into the ring, and I'm just like, you know what? Like, what the hell? So I paid the $20. I got in the ring. I got to pose with the TNA world title. I got a Polaroid with Kurt Angle. The thing that stuck with me was the spaced out, glassy-eyed look on his face. But this was, when was this? This was 2008. So this was probably peak Perk Angle during this period. So that's about what I would expect. And yet he still went out there and had a great match. But they did the $20 Polaroid in the ring gimmick after every single show. And I'm pretty sure that was a Don West idea. And they probably made a small fortune off that. Yeah, it's like Scott D'Amore said, the only man who could sell 5,000 D'Lo Brown bobbleheads after D'Lo Brown left the company. And I got a picture with Don at the baseball stadium show. I got to talk to him for a couple of minutes, and he was the nicest guy. And you know how you meet somebody the first time and you could just tell right off like what kind of person they are? That was Don West. And everybody who knew him better than I did and who worked with him in TNA and everybody who's commented this week and posted tweets has said the exact same thing, that he was just the nicest guy, always positive, always full of energy. Even when they did that angle in TNA, where he cut a heel promo on Mike Tenay. He turned heel on Mike Tenay. He was really good. And then they made him a manager for the Amazing Red for a hot minute, right? House of Glory's own Amazing Red. It didn't last very long, but I know Red has been very complimentary of Don in the past and has said that he was always putting him over. He said Don is the reason why he got his own action figure. So you won't find a bad word said about the man. My condolences to his family and his friends. And one last thing that I thought was a little eerie about the timing of this. Pele passed this week on Thursday, one day before Don did. Also from cancer. Considered by FIFA and others to be the greatest footballer of all time, right? The only man to ever win 3 World Cups. Don West is the man who named AJ Styles' overhead kick the Pele kick. Don is the one who gave the move that name in TNA. And now Pele and Don West both died 24 hours apart. I just thought that was a little eerie.